All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jason Flatt, who I met a couple years ago at the Butler Williams at NIA. Dr. Flatt is an associate adjunct professor at the University of California, San Francisco School of Nursing. Institute for Health and Aging, and his primary affiliation is as an assistant professor at University of Nevada, Las Vegas School of Public Health, Social and Behavioral Health Program. His current research works to better understand concerns and needs of the LGBTQIA+ community living with Alzheimer's disease and their families. He also teaches courses on community-based participatory research and public health theory. He's currently funded by the NIH. NIA is part of a career award exploring dementia risk in LGBTQIA+ older adults, and another grant focused on recruitment and engagement of this community living with dementia and their care partners. Jason is involved in many community efforts. He's really leveraged his platform as a public health researcher to work as an advocate for the LGBTQIA+ community. He's been doing this in Las Vegas, partnering with the LGBT Center of Southern Nevada, Nevada Alliance for Student Diversity, and the Nevada Minority Health Equity Coalition. He also works with Open House in San Francisco and the Los Angeles LGBT Center on projects focused on affordable housing and inclusive care for the LGBTQIA older adults. So as you can see, he's really done a lot of really amazing things, both in academia and for the community. And we're so excited to have him today. And just as a reminder, please use the Q&A to add your questions and comments. And then at the end, I will leave some time so that Jason can answer them. So Jason, thank you again for joining us. And it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I'm excited to be here and talk with you a little bit about the work that I've been doing focused on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias among sexual and gender minorities. And in the beginning of this, I'll describe some of the terminology that I'm using, so I'll get us all on the same page. See. So first, I wanted to just give an overview, and I know many of you have a lot of expertise, even more than me, in terms of dementia, but I wanted to just get us on the same terms and kind of describe how I'm using these. So first, you're going to hear terms like cognition, and when I'm talking about cognition, what I'm referring to is the range of abilities that a person may have. So really thinking memory and thinking skills, language, perception, right? It's this range of abilities that we can measure in populations and determine if they have any concerns with, either cognitive decline, it getting worse, or even potentially meet a threshold for another either mild cognitive impairment or a dementia. So dementia, when I use this term broadly, it's an umbrella term used to encompass really a set of different symptoms, but also disease processes that are happening to someone's brain, right? And these interfere with their function, and they also impact everyday activities. And so one of the most common types of dementia that we often hear about is Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease, right, is really the impact that we see most common has to do with things like loss of memory, maybe the inability to do some of the more complex tasks, things like financial tasks, maybe paying bills, some of those complicated tasks. When I use the term Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, this is broader. And so what it really is encompassing is anyone that may be having some challenges with memory and thinking processes. You'll hear the term as well, mild cognitive impairment. And so when I refer to that, this really represents people that maybe are on either the earlier side, they don't meet the threshold for dementia, but we do see that they have slight but noticeable and measurable decline in their cognitive abilities. And especially we would capture things like memory and thinking skills. And then finally, you're going to hear a term subjective cognitive decline. And as that refers, right, it's self-reported problems with memory and thinking. And so when I'm referring to this, we're typically measuring this in population-based studies, a way to screen a larger sample of people to see if they do have potential concerns, perhaps with memory and thinking, but it is not, we haven't done a cognitive assessment. So it could be a potential concern, and it possibly could be an early symptom of Alzheimer's disease, but it also could be due to something else. It could just be due to inaccurate perceptions. It could be due to another health issue that's impacting someone's memory and thinking, or there may not be any challenges at all. So it's important just to realize that. So sexual and gender minorities. This represents really people who identify as LGBTQIA+. And so when I'm referring to sexual minority, this is an umbrella term that's used to encompass people whose self-identify that their sexual orientation is something else than heterosexual. So they may identify as asexual, right? That is no sexual attraction or sexual behavior or expression at the time. It could be bisexual. This typically represents people who are attracted to both same sex and different sex people. It could represent gay or lesbian people, and it also could represent people that identify as queer or don't use one of these terms, but do not identify as heterosexual. Then a person can be both a sexual minority and a gender minority. So a gender minority refers to people who identify their gender identity or expression as something other than the sex they were assigned at birth. And so this could represent people that identify as transgender, or they may not identify with any gender or consider themselves non-binary, so they're not aligning with either side. It could also include people who are intersex. So people that are intersex are born with differences in their sex characteristics. And so they may have differences in how their body responds to hormones. It could be differences in genetics. So for instance, someone that is XXY. And it could also be someone who has differences in their anatomy, right? And so what we want to do when we think about gender minorities is really think about these are people who do not necessarily fit what social and cultural expectations expect for people that are the sex assigned to them at birth. When I'm using the term cisgender, this represents people whose gender identity or expression aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. And I also want to emphasize that these can change over the lifespan. So sexual orientation and gender identity are not static. And so due to people's life experiences, or even maybe they move from a less accepting environment of sexual and gender minority people to one that is more welcoming and inclusive, and then they feel more comfortable self-identifying. So it's important that we realize that this could even evolve and change for our older adult populations. And so it's important that we measure this, because if we're going to quantify unique concerns for sexual and gender minority people, we have to measure it. Again, I want to just show this image. I really love it. It's the gender unicorn, and this comes from the Trans Student Educational Resource. And so this image, what it shows you here is how gender identity, gender expression, also physical and emotional attraction fall on a continuum, right? And so people do not necessarily align with one side or the other. And it's important that we realize so that these can be a continuum. They can also evolve over time. And just as you see here as well, we typically measure sex assigned at birth as a binary measure, male versus female. But what I'm showing here is that there is actually people can identify as intersex. And so it's important, and we're starting to see this more and more. In fact, just recently in the news, you may have heard that they actually gave the first non-binary gender marker on a passport. I also on the right here want to just represent the diversity of terms that people might use to represent their gender identity. And so it's important just for us to acknowledge the diversity that we're seeing. This also may include people who identify as two-spirit. So these are often members from the indigenous communities. And so it's important that we really evolve how we measure this to be able to represent the needs of our SGM people. So I wanted to bring us to sort of thinking about, my talk is going to focus on dementia and really thinking about the needs of sexual and gender minority people. And so I wanted to frame, what do we currently know? And I want to emphasize it's not a lot, because we have not been asking about people's sexual orientation and gender identity, especially in some of our population-based and longitudinal aging studies. For instance, the health and retirement study didn't even start asking this, I think, until around 2017. So here I show that we know that there are an estimated 2.7 million SGM people living in the United States that are aged 50 or older. And we know that LGBTQ plus people experience health disparities. And many of these disparities are linked to both historical and current discrimination, oppression, unequal access to resources for the LGBTQ plus community. So for instance, we know there are higher rates of depression, and we know that people with depression in late life could have a 2 to 3-fold increase in risk for dementia. We also see unique concerns around cardiovascular disease, some of the health behaviors that we know that can be risk factors for dementia can be higher in subgroups of the LGBTQ plus community. And we also know that there's a large proportion of LGBTQ plus people that are currently living with dementia. So they're younger than their heterosexual cisgender counterparts, but we know at least 350,000 LGBTQ plus older adults are currently living with Alzheimer's disease. And this represents around 7% or higher of the community. The other concern for this community really is focused on some of the unique challenges that they experience in getting care if they have dementia. So we know, for instance, that there's a huge concern around access to caregiving support. We know that over 40% of LGBTQ people are seeing that their support networks are becoming smaller over time. We know that LGBTQ plus people are much more likely to live alone compared to their non-LGBTQ peers. So over a third live alone. We also know that there are lower rates, right, of accessing healthcare. And much of this is due to historical experiences with discrimination. So many LGBTQ plus elders grew up in a time when they would be diagnosed with a mental health disorder because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. In fact, today for transgender people, they cannot even start to receive affirming care until they have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So this can be very discouraging. It's harmful to the community, and it impacts why they're reluctant to access care, especially early on. The other issue is the economic cost to the community. So Alzheimer's disease is the most expensive disease in the nation. And we know that LGBTQ plus people experience economic hardships over half of them are worried about being able to have enough money to live on. And then again, thinking about caregiving and meeting healthcare providers, there's a lot of fear about discrimination because people have experienced in the past. I just want to call out this issue brief. If you haven't had a chance to take a look, the Alzheimer's Association and SAGE, Advocacy for Services for LGBT Elders, put out this report. I believe it was back in like 2018, and it highlights a lot of the unique concerns for the community. So prior to jumping in and kind of understanding why should we be, one, asking about sexual orientation and gender identity, but also I wanted to build some background of why do we consider SGM people to be a health disparities population? Well, we know that historically, this community has faced oppression in society. In fact, here I show images of one of the major pivotal moments in LGBTQ plus rights. And this was in the early mornings of June 28th, 1969, when the trans community were leading the fight against police brutality and the raiding of LGBTQ plus spaces. And it was this night that the police raided the Stonewall Inn, and they came in and they started arresting people. Well, out as they were arresting people, a member of the trans community was being pushed into the back of the police vehicle, and her heel went up and it hit the police officer. He began to attack the person with a club, and the community saw this brutality, and this started the days of the Stonewall riots and really the advocacy for the end of brutality against the community. So I wanted to also share with you just a little bit of a very brief timeline that highlights some of the unique concerns for the LGBTQ plus community. So first, thinking even prior to the 1960s, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there were systematic discrimination in the federal government towards LGBTQ plus people. So it was during the McCarthy era when they had what was called the Lavender Scare, but also this view that LGBTQ people were communists. And so they were searching for them in the federal government and terminating them. As well as we saw similar discrimination against LGBTQ people in the military, right? So here I highlight, right, these are some of the rights in terms of progress for the community, the Stonewall riots. We saw this also happening earlier in Philadelphia. We saw work in Boston. We saw work in Los Angeles and San Francisco. But this really drove the community to advocate for rights. And then we don't even see that marriage equality came until 2015. So much of the focus for the community was around some of the protections that we see, retirement, right? Benefits, those pieces that are so important for health and also just independence. And so that didn't even happen until 2015. So it's important that we acknowledge some of these to understand how it has the community been impacted. So there have been lack of opportunity. We still today are seeing, right, a lot of anti-transgender legislation that's happening across the South, focused on not allowing transgender people to compete in sports, just many different avenues, not being able to receive affirming care. And we see other challenges around still employment protections, housing, and healthcare. And we know that this also intersects and can compound the effects of discrimination when we think about people that have intersecting marginalized identities. So for instance, an LGBTQ plus person that's also a person of color, or an LGBTQ person living with a disability or living with HIV. So these can be really unique challenges. And when we think about what does it take for successful aging, So in this image in the bottom, and I apologize, I know it's pretty small, but what it highlights here, the cornerstones of successful aging are economic security, having strong and supportive social connections, and then having opportunities for promoting your own health and well-being. Well, these are key challenges for the LGBTQ plus community, right? They faced both lifetime and current discrimination and a lack of legal and social recognition in society. This has impacted their health over the life course. We also know that they're more likely to live alone. And when it comes to seeking out care, they often have to rely on chosen family members. These are friends, these are neighbors, these are members of the LGBTQ plus community that support one another. Many people, when they were coming out in their earlier life, lost the support of their families. Many of them were rejected. It was highly stigmatized in society, and so they may not be able to rely on any biological family for support. And then finally, we know there are still ongoing challenges with healthcare. Many people experience discrimination. Not allowing your partner or chosen family member to be a part of the care experience is another challenge. So given all of these hardships, I think it's important just to emphasize that we do know that the community faces health disparities, right? Poor health, depression, disability. We know that they face unique social challenges around less likely to be married, not have children, right? Not have the traditional caregiving supports that we see for people as they get older. And so these are unique challenges. And again, I love this image that kind of highlights some of the unique challenges for the community, but also emphasizes that this interacts when we think about LGBTQ plus people of color, right? And some of the unique challenges that we also see in our racial ethnic minority communities. So I'm going to now jump into some of the research that I've been doing focused on dementia and cognition among the community. So the first study I wanted to share is a population-based study using the behavioral risk factor surveillance system study data. This comes from 25 states in the US. And what we were looking at in this module is we wanted to see around subjective cognitive decline. So these were optional questions, both sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as the subjective cognitive decline module. But it did ask for those across these many years if over the past 12 months, have they been experiencing confusion or memory loss that has been happening more often or getting worse? And in fact, when we look at SGM people compared to non-SGM people, we do see a significant difference. So we see 1 in 7 are experiencing subjective cognitive decline compared to around 1 in 10 for their non-SGM peers. And I'll highlight some other concerns that we're also seeing. So the other piece that we're seeing is we wanted to look across the subgroups and see within the LGBTQ community who is experiencing more subjective cognitive decline. Well, what we saw was the prevalence was much higher for lesbian, not transgender or cisgender females. We also saw it being higher for bisexual people, nearly 17%, right? Almost creeping up on 18%. So the highest of all the groups. Then we also saw it for people who identified their sexual orientation as another identity, but were not transgender. And then we also saw high rates for transgender individuals of all sexual orientations. So what's unique here is that we're seeing for gay cisgender men, not much of a higher concern. Their concerns look very similar to their hetero cisgender counterparts. So something to think about is whether one reason we expect this is perhaps even within the LGBTQ plus community, there are discrimination and other forms of oppression happening, right? Where historically gay men have held on to power and resources in the community. And this is one hypothesis around why we're seeing concerns for other members. Additionally, we see when we look at how is the subjective cognitive decline impacting the daily lives of people. Well, what we found for SGM people is that they're more likely to report giving up their day-to-day activities due to their subjective cognitive decline. They're also more likely to report that they need help with household tasks, things like cleaning, maintaining the home, preparing meals. So very concerning. And then finally, they reported that it was more likely to interfere with their ability to do social activities, work, or volunteer. So what this suggests is the subjective cognitive decline being experienced by LGBTQ plus people is much more potentially severe, but it's also more likely to impact their daily lives. So that is a concern for us in terms of providing care. The next really piece that's important to see is that both LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ people are not talking to their healthcare providers about it. So more than 50% for both. And likely this may be due to concerns around losing independence, fears of being institutionalized because of memory problems. And the big piece is people are concerned about losing their driver's license. So that could be explaining it, but it's also there's a great need for educating the community about the concerns and how they can prepare. So now I'm going to jump into some data that comes from my Career Development Award. And this really focuses on 3 aims, and I'll only be touching on the first 2 today. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what are we seeing in terms of risk of dementia in SGM people, and then what are we seeing in terms of risk and protective factors, and looking to see if those differ compared to non-SGM people. So for this study, I am using medical record data from Kaiser Permanente. Back in 2007, they started what was called the Research Program for Genes, Environments, and Health. And of this, a cohort was asked in 2007 about their sexual orientation. So there were nearly 2,000 people in this cohort, and we identified over 4,300 people that were a sexual minority and age 60 and older. So about a quarter identified as lesbian. You can see over a third were gay men and over a third identified as bisexual, with a little bit less than half identifying as female. We did not have information about trans or gender identity, so we weren't able to explore that. And at the time when I was doing this project, we know there's a lot of stigmatization of the trans community. So Kaiser was actually reluctant for us to pull that out of the medical record at the time. So I won't be able to talk about that today. But I did want to share what we did is we were able to access people's medical record data for over 10 years. And so we really pulled data from 1996 to 2015, and we were looking at ICD-9 codes for relevant diagnoses, things like dementia. And so we broadly included all types of dementia because the Kaiser is an integrated healthcare system, but diagnoses of dementia could occur in primary care, or they could occur through a specialist like in neurology. So the specificity in terms of the type of dementia is not as accurate. So we weren't able to really look at subgroups. We just broadly defined it as Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Our analyses of this data really focused on, doing some Cox proportional hazard models to take advantage of the longitudinal nature of the data, We included age in there as a time scale, and then I wanted to look at differences by gender, as well as we censored anyone that died or had a greater than 90-day gap in their health plan coverage, because they would potentially have a loss to follow up, or we would have inaccurate data points in the medical record. So this is a little bit of the demographic background for our sample. So what we see in here that's important to look at, where the little asterisks are, is that we see that the cohort is about 2 years younger. Oh, sorry about that. I did it again. So about 2 years younger in age for sexual minority people. We see that they were much more likely to identify as male. And then we saw some kind of differences in race ethnicity. So what we saw was a larger proportion of sexual minorities identified as Asian. And then finally, what we saw in terms of education, which was interesting to us because education is a protective factor, higher education. So we saw a higher number of sexual minorities having a college degree or higher, but they were much more likely to never have been married, and more than a third reported living alone. In terms of risk and protective factors that we wanted to look at, some of the key ones that we identified focused on age. So we did find that the sexual minority cohort was younger. We saw that they had higher rates of education. So nearly 66% had a college degree compared to less than 50% for heterosexual people. We saw higher rates of depression. And then we also saw that there was a much higher rate of diagnosis of HIV positive in this cohort. So we wanted to account for those and look at differences. So here is what we found in terms of dementia prevalence broadly. And this really fits what we're seeing on a national level. So we saw about 7.4% had a diagnosis of dementia in 2007, compared to less than 9% for heterosexuals. Again, we think this difference is largely explained by the age difference in the cohorts. When we look at dementia diagnosis based on the age of diagnosis, what we saw here is that sexual minorities are being diagnosed at nearly a year or more earlier than their heterosexual counterparts. And so that's potentially concerning to us to think about, why is that we're seeing earlier ages of diagnosis? Is it due to greater healthcare use? Is it due to some other concern? And so this is a potential area that we'll continue to explore. Looking at when we did the Cox proportional hazard models and stratified our study by gender, what we found that was unique is that sexual minority women had a 23% increase in risk over a follow-up period of about 6 years on average, right? While sexual minority males, there was no difference compared to their heterosexual counterparts. So this right here is suggesting a potential area that we should consider continuing to study. We did account for the differences in age, race, ethnicity, and education, but when we account for differences in depression, it does attenuate the difference. So this is suggesting to us that there is a concern around dementia risk for the LGBTQ plus community, and specifically among sexual minority females. So what is this? How does this align with other research, and what are we finding in terms of dementia related outcomes in the LGBTQ or SGM community? Well, I want to highlight one of the first studies. I collaborated with Jaime Perales-Puchal, and we looked at the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center data. What we found were subtle increases in risks for mild cognitive impairment and dementia for people that were in same-sex relationships versus opposite sex. But these did not reach statistical significance. And so what we were seeing are these trends, but it's important to acknowledge that this is a very unique cohort. So the majority of people come from they're referred by healthcare providers. And so this may not be generalizable to the broader general public or populations, but it's suggesting it was one of the earliest works to look at dementia and MCI risk. Looking at a national population-based sample using Medicare beneficiaries, there was some unique work that came out in 2017 that looked at Medicare beneficiary files around 2015 for people who had a transgender procedure or diagnosis code in their medical record. And so what they found here when they looked at rates of dementia were much higher diagnoses of dementia for trans people versus cisgender, not transgender people, 18% versus 12%. And this was concerning to us. Now, looking at the Medicare data, this is people entitled based on their age. So everyone was 65 and older, right? But there were also some other concerns that we saw for transgender people. So they had higher rates of diabetes, more than double the rate of depression. So 54% compared to 25% in cisgender people. We also saw higher rates of hypertension and obesity. So likely we believe this is due to the oppression and discrimination that transgender people in our country experience. And so this was a very concerning number for us that requires further study. Looking at another national study from the 2015-2016 National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, or NSHAP, what we found for LGB adults is a 2-time higher odds of MCI or early dementia compared to their heterosexual counterparts. So this was another study suggesting there's a concern for the community. Then looking at one of the well-studied, the same-sex couples using the health and retirement study. So they looked at same-sex couples versus opposite or different sex partners, and they found that the odds of cognitive impairment were 78% higher for same-sex couples than it was for different sex, after accounting for differences in age, income, educational background. So again, another signal that there are concerns for the community. I want to emphasize that perspective really matters. And when we're thinking about our country and things around equity, it's important to acknowledge, yes, we've made a lot of progress. I'm happy to say that most of us, today coming from Nevada, but also talking to you in Boston, we live in states where there are a lot more protections for sexual minority people, right? But this doesn't exist all over the state. And so we know that people living in the South experience a lot of discrimination. But I also wanted to emphasize what we're seeing for our trans or gender minority communities. And so what this is emphasizing in this other map are all of these negative policies that have been focused on targeting trans people, preventing them from receiving healthcare that is affirming, its lack of protection around the bathrooms they're using, trying to pass policies that dictate, the restroom that someone uses, as well as things like sports and jobs and all those protections. So it's really important that we consider, right, both the geographic location of our communities, but some of the pieces that are happening historically to oppress the community. And so we need a lot more work. Building more on gender minorities, I just want to emphasize this is a group that really deserves more of our work. We know they are disproportionately impacted by social inequities, right? So we know that they experience unique risks for memory problems, and dementia. We know they're 2 times as likely to be living in poverty as their non-trans counterparts. They're 3 times more likely to be homeless or unemployed. We see much higher rates of mental health challenges, likely due to the trauma that this community has experienced over their lifetime. So we see a 9 times higher risk of suicide. We see higher rates of abuse and trauma for this community. We know that there have been an increase in our country of anti-transgender hate crimes, healthcare refusal, but also discrimination. There's a lot of mistreatment of this community, treated as though a trans person, as they walk in the door, that they have a mental health problem. There's something wrong with them because of their identity. And this is really harmful. And we know that this has been happening historically. So there's also distrust of the medical community. Trans people do not want to access care because they've been mistreated over and over again. So it's an area that we really need to be emphasizing for this community, but even more so why we need to collect affirming ways of assessing gender identity. So we have a lot of gaps still in our knowledge. So we do not have population-based data that collects information for SGM people. We know that, for instance, the Census Bureau doesn't assess all of the questions. They've started to look more at same-sex couples, but there's a need for greater data collection. I've already highlighted that our communities of color, right, people with intersecting identities, face unique challenges. We know, for instance, even broadly that we know of, we don't know about people's sexual orientation and gender identity, but for instance, we know African Americans experience some of the highest rates of dementia compared to, right, Caucasian and other communities. This is really concerning, and this is a concern that we see for our SGM community. We don't have a lot of longitudinal research. Yes, I'm accessing medical record data, but most medical record data does not have sexual orientation and gender identity collected in it. We might be able to identify a transgender person based on if they're receiving affirming care or procedures related to their gender. But if they're not, we wouldn't be able to identify them. And then we need to really be looking at the subgroups, right? Disaggregating the data, understanding unique concerns by age, but also, as I had showed, right, we're seeing subgroups reporting higher rates of subjective cognitive decline. So I'm going to close up and just give a few takeaways. So we're seeing either similar or higher rates of Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment in SGM populations. If this is truly a concern and we still don't know, especially the subjective cognitive decline pieces, we need to be promoting greater screening and encouraging people with subjective cognitive decline to talk to a healthcare provider or find a way to connect them to resources. The other piece that we will greatly need is collection of sexual orientation and gender identity. So I'm going to share with you, we have a recent publication in the Journals of Gerontology that highlights some questions that potentially could be asked as part of the work you might be doing, especially population-based studies. And it's important that I put in here the option of allowing people to self-identify and check more than one option, right? Maybe they don't align with one of these terms, but they don't identify as heterosexual, as well as if you start to find that you're recruiting more members that self-identify, right, as another sexual orientation, I encourage you to adapt your questions over time to be more welcoming of those you're working with. As well, we recommend when you ask about gender identity, you follow a 2-step approach. So you first ask people to self-identify their current gender identity, right? And again, we allow them to select more than one option. And then we ask about the sex they were assigned at birth on their birth certificate. So we can do that. It's important, as I mentioned, this may evolve over time. So you can ask sexual orientation and gender identity again, but I would recommend if you've collected sex assigned at birth, you don't need to ask that every time. That won't change. So I want to also say we need tailored interventions, and we need to be doing more to advocate for the SGM community, especially around caregiving, supporting families of choice, and making sure that services are welcoming for everybody. I always say that if we improve care for SGM people, it's going to end up improving care for everyone. So with that, I wanted to highlight what is coming next. Well, currently we're recruiting. I have a partnership with Emory University, Whitney Wharton there. And so we have a study called Equality in Caregiving. We're doing some formative work to really learn about the caregiving needs of LGBTQ plus caregivers of people living with dementia. So if you know anybody or this interests you, I encourage you to share this with them. We also, in the next couple of years, are going to have some really exciting work coming out. I've partnered with my colleagues, Dr. Joel Anderson, an expert in SGM caregiving of people with dementia, Whitney Wharton, who oversees Alzheimer's disease and related dementias among diverse communities, but is also focused on SGM people, and then myself. And so we're going to be, over the next 3 years, creating a recruitment registry to enroll SGM people who are interested in participating in dementia research, as well as building a lot of visibility and advocacy for the community. So we're really excited for this work to be coming. Finally, I think the big piece that we need more of is mentoring and supporting early stage investigators or those that want to do work with the community. So we greatly need more work. And as part of this, I just have one message to take away for you to know is that if you're going to work with the LGBTQ plus community, much like working with other communities, right? It's so important to give back. I focus a lot on community-based participatory research, but I think the piece that I want to emphasize is if you're doing research with this community, you need to be hiring LGBTQIA plus people to work on your projects. You need to be giving back, giving money to the community, supporting the work they're doing, paying people for their time, and showing up, right? If you're going to be there, make sure you come. And so I just really want to emphasize that. Finally, just to close out, I want to emphasize it takes a village to do this work. And so I'm so grateful to my colleagues who have helped support me in this work and just wanted to acknowledge them. I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. And I just thank you for your time, and I'm ready to move into questions. I think
Oops, I was talking to myself.
That's okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, for such an amazing presentation. We have a couple of questions. The
Sure.
first one comes from Allison. She asked, do you think that the increased rates of decreasing independence and function have anything to do with non-traditional SGM family structure? Has there been any work done to look at this?
Allison, that's a great question. I possibly, right? We definitely know that, right? There isn't the same sources of care support, and we know, right, it's families of choice, and many people are more likely to live alone. So that is quite possible, not having the support you need to stay independent. Or even we can think about it in terms of social capital, right? If you're not as well connected to others, then you're not going to be able to leverage some of the resources and support that you might need. There's another really unique concern for subgroups, but many SGM people who have been, trying to overcome oppression over their lifetime. And so many of them have not planned for older age, right? They weren't thinking about this. They were really living in the moment every day, just basically keeping going. And so they may not have had the support systems or structures in place. And your second question has, I don't think much work has been done in that space of really understanding what might contribute to decreasing independence and function. So we definitely need more research in that area.
Thank you. And then we have another question. Do you have suggestions for researchers to collect sexual and gender identity information and respecting participant privacy who may be concerned about reporting this information?
Yeah, so much like I shared, right, this would be my recommendation in terms of some questions you should consider, but these are not the only ones. I encourage you to check out your local resource in Boston, the Fenway Institute. They've done so much work around the ways to engage the community. Another piece that I would encourage you to think about is getting training, right? Meeting with SGM people, learning about how to ask these questions, building trust, right? Explaining how the information will be used, how it'll be protected, the fact that you're going to use nondescript identifiers or de-identify the data to protect their identity. You're absolutely right that you have to build trust with the community. If you're not a researcher that does work in this space, I encourage you to reach out, to local community members, to your local LGBT center, to other researchers, or even, Fenway Health would be amazing, right? To get advice on how to build relationships with the community. Is much like the work that everyone is doing. And I know a lot of you are doing work in the health disparities space and working with minority communities. And so I would say it takes similar approaches that you've been building with doing research with minority communities, building trust, letting them know how the data is going to be used, potentially creating an advisory board that guides the work that you do. It really takes, those efforts, really meeting people where they are, but being comfortable with learning and making mistakes, right? But trying your best to follow best practices. That's, I think, is key. And remember, LGBTQ plus people are not going to be offended that you're asking about their sexual orientation and gender identity. They actually will be surprised, and it will make it feel at least you are understanding that their needs are important, and you can emphasize that's why you're collecting the data.
Thanks, Jason. And
Mhm.
we still have a few minutes, so feel free to add your questions to the Q&A or chat. I myself have a question. So we as neuropsychologists, if when we have patients who identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus community,
Mhm.
maybe what are some of the factors or questions we should be asking, but mostly factors that we should take into account, maybe when we're thinking about not only assessing cognition, but also interpreting um, their cognitive profile, given your
Mhm.
findings with SCD and well, the rest of your research.
Yeah, well, I think it's right, much like we do kind of thinking about like life course or factors that have contributed to their experiences. So I think, being able to collect demographic data on like educational experiences, potentially, right, thinking about um identity and differences for the community, making sure from the point where if you have someone coming in to do an assessment that, right, they know the space is welcoming. They can see images of diverse people, right? Images of diverse couples, not just heterosexual couples included in any images, or right, it's from the moment you're starting to engage them that would be important. I don't think there's any like specific things you would want to look at. It would be similar to, right, we know the risk and protective factors for dementia or for cognitive impairment, right? And so we need to be collecting that, just like you're collecting information on educational background differences, right? We should be collecting it on things like income and housing and employment. And we know, for instance, the community may be more likely to live alone, right? Or be experiencing social isolation. That's going to be important for everybody, but it's important when you're looking at it for, LGBTQIA plus people to make sure those measures are there. I think it might be important to know about, does anyone have a caregiver, right? That could be another area that's going to be important. I think when you're doing your cognitive testing, a lot of times you have to rely on an informant, right? To give some background on like what are the impairments they're seeing. You may not have that for LGBTQIA plus people. So I think having workarounds for that, or ways that you can still collect important information on their everyday, is going to be important. So it may require, you're not going to have the best informant. It's a neighbor. It's right. It's a friend. Maybe it's a roommate. They might have a better idea given they're living with the individual, but it's changing. We typically, in our dementia and work, we're always thinking of like a spouse, or maybe a child, right? An adult child of the elder. And for LGBTQIA plus people, we might have to expand that a bit. So that would be important.
Thank you. Well,
Mhm.
we are out of time, but again, Jason, thank you so much
Absolutely.
for sharing your such important work with us. And thank you everyone for coming. Please visit our website for next month's presentation. And we hope to see you in person in the future, Jason. Maybe share some of your updates with us.
Absolutely. I would love to do that. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, bye everyone. Have a great weekend.